Appalachia. Everybody in the world has a reaction to that word. It makes folks think everything from beautiful mountaintop views, dangerous hillbillies running through the woods with a rifle in one hand and a jug of shine in the other, all the way to trailer parks, drugs, and blame near everything in between all of that. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch along the eastern U.S. from Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks who live in these mountains have seen and endured enough things to have happened that make a preacher cuss. Now, hello, I'm Larry Bentley. I was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains of Southwest Virginia, and I was raised by folks who lived there for generations right there in them old mountains. Now, come with me and we'll take a look at some of the odd, awful, and legendary things that happen within my beloved mountains, and we'll be traveling around a bit, looking through the eyes of an old Appalachian at some of the crazy that spreads itself around outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 6 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. Hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by here, and welcome back. Now, we've talked powwow, hex, and murder in a previous episode called just that. Today we're not talking about some ghost up a holler or a witch that turns a farmer's milk into curds. Nope, today we're wading into Slapnut Central to have a look at plain old meanness. We're talking about cold hard cash and the kind of folks who'd sell their soul and a poor old man's life just to get their hands on a little bit of folding money. Now we're heading up to Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, near a little place called Hoon's Run, back in the year of our good Lord of 1878. Now the hills around there are generally peaceful folks. You know, the folks that work hard, they go to church, and unless somebody's in need of help, they mostly leave their neighbors alone. Typical Appalachian living, if you ask me, but every now and again, the devil rolls through and puts an idea in somebody's head that's just too ugly or maybe enticing to ignore. And in this case, he danced through that area with a 9-foot grand, a 10-piece band, and a 12-girl chorus line, sprinkling the same blame idea that was a bad idea, like fairy dust from hell, into about 6 different heads that didn't look a whole lot better than the ugly ideas that he sprinkled them in. Now, the idea was life insurance. Of course, that life insurance would be for some poor, unwitting, unsuspecting, naive older individual that thought the 6 slugs were his best friends and who he cared for like family. Then, once the insurance was all signed and paid up, all they had to do was sit around like a whole wake of buzzards and wait. Turns out, that's a little bit hard to do when there's a big payday waiting and the object of your affection keeps waking up and flat-footing it through life like he's fit as a fiddle. So come on in, take your shoes off, and set a spell while I take and unscrew this one right off of hell's front door. Now, this ain't no commercial. I'm just saying that we all know that life insurance is a great thing. Protects our family when we shuffle off to the great unknown. But when you start looking at life insurance, at that policy, you know, less like a safety net and more like a lottery ticket that just needs a little bit of help to be a winner, well, that's when things can go sideways pretty blame quick. For Joseph Raber, he was a sweet, naive, maybe a little simple-minded, and apparently expendable old man. That sideways weren't no turn missed in Albuquerque. It was a one-way straight to the great ever after. Now, our story starts with an outright con. These 6 fellers, you might say, were a collection of ne'er-do-wells, farm hands, and general shifty morons all got together. And when I say 6, I mean 6 men who, by sheer coincidence, all happen to have the distinctly pale, icy blue set of eyes. Now, since we all know where this is headed, I may as well tell you now that them eyes would lead to press slapping them with the nickname the Blue-Eyed Six. It's the kind of headline that sells papers, and believe you me, this story sold papers, hand over fist. Now, the ringleader, the guy with the most brass and the least conscience, was a feller named Franklin Stickler. Frank was a smooth talker, Well, as far as the other slapnuts in the gaggle of idiots were concerned, anyway. Apparently, he didn't take much, or it didn't take much to hold that position. As far as they were concerned, he was the kind of feller that could convince you that a rusty old, rusted out, nasty buggy was a brand new Cadillac. Now, he had the whole thing planned out, pretty meticulous for a nutball, except for the tiny detail that murder usually don't go down like it's planned most of the time. Now, the crew included the aforementioned Franklin Stickler, the, I guess for a lack of a better term, brains of the outfit and a real piece of dog squeeze. Then there was Israel Pop Brant, an older man who was easy to influence, pretty well broke, and apparently on the brink of flat out starving to death in order to get caught up in a mess like this, I reckon. But Henry F. Wise was another one. He was the blacksmith that apparently, I guess everybody around them parts said was a respectable, upstanding man. Apparently he had a hole in his soul where the morals used to be, and he hit it pretty well. Then there was Josiah Hummel, who was a farmer that needed folding money, not them little bits of change that his so-called half-assed efforts were bringing in. Now, some pronounce these names a hair different than I do, but it's the way I heard them and said, I guess, so I'll just use it and stick with it that way. He needed a shortcut and jumped right into water was fine anyway. So, but then there was Charles Drews, another farmer with what they called a soft-headed way about him. From what I found, that meant that he was easily swayed into coming aboard the one-way ticket straight to hell. Then there was George Zachman. He was referred to as the muscle or the lookout of the gaggle of misfits. Of course, their target was poor old Joseph Raber. Joe was a bachelor who'd, as far as any of them knew, always lived alone. He worked as a coal miner and was, to put it gently as possible, what grifters referred to as a soft touch, meaning that if you told him that the sky was falling, he'd run and get his hard hat, kind of soft touch. Now, he was about 55 years old, and as we've established, just a little bit slow on the uptake, and completely unaware that these 6 snakes in the grass were circling him like buzzards. Now, the plan was simple. It absolutely unfathomably stupid at the same time, I guess, but they talked poor old Mr. Raber into taking out 3 different insurance policies on his life. Now, that totaled a whopping $8,000. Now, $8,000 in 1878, that's about $200,000 in today's money. Pretty good fortune for them rural Rockefeller wannabes, I reckon. Probably told the poor man that when he died, he'd be rich, and he was tickled to sign the papers after that. But first clue that these fellers were either geniuses or dumber than a sack full of hammers was the fact that they paid the premiums for old Mr. Raber because Mr. Raber sure as heck didn't have the money to pay them. And by doing that, they named themselves, or at least the wives of some of them, as the beneficiaries. Now, just step back and have a look at it and let it steep for a second. 6 broke guys with matching blue eyes come out of the wild blue yonder with enough money to ensure the life of a single elderly coal miner who was slow as molasses in the wintertime and wasn't even related to him. And they make it so that they're the ones getting the payoff. Heck, Ronnie Millsap could see the red flags waving all over that one. But back then, they were a little looser with the rules. You might say less regulation and more opportunity. So the policies were signed, the premiums were paid, and the countdown clock starts ticking for Mr. Raber, who's walking around thinking that once he offs to the kingdom, and he's got it made in the shade, I guess, because he's able to buy him anything he wants. All that stood between our blue-eyed crew and $250,000 was the small matter of escorting old Mr. Raber on over to the other side. And these fellers weren't, by a long shot, what somebody would call criminal masterminds. They were paying money that they didn't have into a policy that didn't pay off unless somebody died, and about as subtle as a methed up Jersey bull in a china shop. And you can practically hear the banjo hitting the Foggy Mountain breakdown and getting closer and faster now, because the execution of the plan was pretty much a comedy, show for, I guess, comedy show full of errors, and would actually be funny if the punchline wasn't Old Man Raber laid out in the pine box in the undertaker's establishment. Now, they tried a few different things. Bless their little hearts. They figured that they needed to make it look like an accident or maybe a natural death. After all, insurance don't pay out for a good old-fashioned neck stabbing, especially by somebody that's been making insurance payments and were named as the beneficiaries. Now, the first try was when the boys tried to get Mr. Raber to flat out drink himself to death. They pumped him full of that cheap rot gut whiskey, hoping he'd keel over from alcohol poison or stumble out into the mountains and just expire due to exposure. Maybe if they were a little bit lucky, he just might croak over once that rot gut turned his liver into a catcher's mitt. Well, Mr. Raber just got sloshed to the high heavens and was more of a happy drunk than a gonna die any minute type of drunk. Now, the second try was what we might call the exposure stunt. They tried to leave him out in the cold. They got him all drunked up again, dragged him out, and threw him in a wagon, and then they hauled him all out into the middle of nowhere in the freezing Pennsylvania mountain night. They dumped him near a creek and figured the weather would do the rest. But Joe Raber, being coal miner tough, woke up the next morning, cold as a well digger's hindquarters, but alive and feeling like he'd just dug his way up out of his own grave, complaining about his head ringing and being cold. The third day, because they hadn't thought that maybe it ain't a road they want to go down, well, they could be the train trick, I guess is what we'd call this one. This is the one that takes the cake, I guess, for sheer boneheadedness. They tried to set him up to be hit by a train. They got him all drunk up all over again, always with the rot gut booze, tried to tie him up to the railroad tracks and waited for the midnight freight train to shred him up like mincemeat. But somebody, I guess even the killer has a limit. They got the cold feet, and last minute they drug Old Man Raber off the tracks just seconds before the engine blasted by. Now, in this game, 3 strikes and you're still not out. At this point, you got to admire their stubbornness, if nothing else. They were always trying to be on the sly about the whole thing. They wanted the insurance company to think, that give them the money and just not give them a one-way ticket to a hemp necktie party over at the steakhouse or the State House. Now, Mr. Raber was proven to be kind of like a cockroach, which, and if anybody knows anything about them things, are pretty hard to kill. They realized that if you want a man dead, you're going to have to stop being cute about it. So on the night of September 29th, 1878, cutesy time was over. The blue-eyed gang of scroats finally decided to stop messing around. They took Mr. Raber back out to the same spot in the middle of nowhere, Appalachia, near Hoon's Run, near the creek. The weather was pretty chilly, and they poured him another snoot full of the radiator hooch, getting him all good and drunk, like they usually did. And then all 6 of them were already about half pissed that he was still breathing to start with, and were trying to figure out a way to make him just go away. Being the happy drunk that he was, he probably cracked off some kind of joke that pushed her cheese right off the crackers and caused them all 6 to snap in unison. This time they pounced on the old boy like a gaggle of ducks on a June bug and held him down, facing his head right under the water, and 6 against 1, against one old drunk coal miner. Well, clearly being a coal miner meant that he was a tough old bird, but his age, he probably was ate up with arthritis, and that limited his ability to move very well in the first place, let alone having enough to drink to probably be teetering on the edge of consciousness on top of that. So it wasn't too hard for the 6 of them to hold him under that cold creek water until the bubbles stopped coming up, and then some. They flat out drowned him. That was a massive, desperate, and pretty unsubtle way to get rid of a man for money, but I reckon they figured by then they didn't have a choice. They were going broke paying the insurance while he was partying it up and living life with his new friends, which he thought the world of. without a care in the world. Then they got all lizard-brained up and came up with a cover story. They pulled up Mr. Raber out of the creek and, in a fit of moronic genius, stripped him down to his underclothes and laid him out on the bank because everybody knows that's how people accidentally drown. Now, they came up with the story that he got drunk as a skunk, staggered off into the creek, fell in, and drowned by accident. Now, they figured that dog would hunt as the perfect insurance claim. Then, even figured out that nobody would find him out there in the middle of nowhere, so they had the gall to run back to town and tell everybody that they found his body, being that if nobody found it, there wouldn't be no insurance money coming. So, the whole gaggle of lunatics rode all the way back to town. Yes, all 6 of them. Now, they put on a big show of whining, crying, moaning, and wailing about poor Joe Raber, who they were worried about. They'd been so worried about him that they'd went out looking for him, and danged if they didn't find his body. I reckon none of them thought that it just might be a scotch suspicious that poor old man Raber went missing and was found before enough time had went by for anybody to realize that he was missing and get worried about it in the first place. But the local coroner, a man who probably saw more cases of farming accidents than foul play, ruled it a simple drowning due to intoxication. So the wackadoodles are thinking that that was easy peasy. Where's our money? Not so fast there, you pack of slap nuts. Even back then, and just because of shit like this, insurance companies had their own investigators who poked around before checks got cut. And they weren't quite as dumb as and as accepting as of the innocence of people as maybe the run-of-the-mill coroner might be. And first question that the insurance company had was, why are 6 men all of a sudden hanging around a dead man's grave like a pack of badgers looking for a helpless rabbit? Now, and they were asking about the insurance payoffs. They figured that stunk worse than a rotten catfish, and even Jethro Bodine could do the math on that one. Now, the insurance company, well, they smelled a rat right out of the gate. Another thing they wanted to know was, why would an old poor bachelor have $8,000 in insurance policies? And why would all the beneficiaries be a tight-knit group of nutballs who are the ones who are circling his grave wanting payment before he's cold in the ground? So the insurance company refused to pay, probably just to see how much the geniuses would bitch about it. Then they promptly called in a private detective. Yeah, you got it, the Pinkertons, being that they were the best there was back then, and them fellers were a lot sharper than the local sheriff and the coroner put together. Of course, that was all well and good, but in this case, they really didn't need to be that sharp. All they had to do was go into the mountains and plug into the gossip line. That's where they heard stuff like, did you hear about them 6 fellers who were always circling Mr. Raber like a pack of jackals before he died? Or maybe it seems mighty odd that they were always pouring him full of that bathtub whiskey. And how comes it is that they're the ones that found him before anybody even knew he was lost? Now, one of the men's son-in-law, Joseph Peters, had witnessed the whole blame thing from start to finish, and he started to crack up like he was ready to star in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, he was the weak link in the chain of deception, and the Pinkertons pounced on and pressed him hard. He was offered immunity to turn state's evidence. And wouldn't you know it, Mr. Peters folded up like a lawn chair and started singing like Jackson Browne on his Running on Empty tour in 1978. He sang the whole ugly murder song right out for him, with 2 encores on the failed murder attempts and the rot gut whiskey, the mincemeat train, and the part where Mr. Raber left his body the hard way, exited the plate of life stage left. And just like that, there it was, like a turd floating to the top of a punch bowl at the pastor's funeral. 6 blue-eyed murderers exposed by their own greed and stupidity. Once the confession came, then came all the pouncing on, arresting, and dragging downtown of some blue-eyed ass. Now, which, as usual, probably happened around supper time that evening. All 6 were frog marched straight to the Dauphin County Prison, all charged up with the outright and unprovoked murder of poor Joseph Raber for profit. There weren't no questions that this bunch of lunatics were going straight to the smart hemp dance if they got caught or got convicted. I'm sorry. Now, when the trial came up, it was what always happened in a big crime when a big crime was on the docket. It was a cotton picking sensation. Reporters poured into Harrisonburg from all over the place. It was the O.J. Simpson trial of 1879. Press kept calling them the Blue-Eyed Six, playing on their, unusual matching eye color, turning the local murder into a national spectacle. Now, the defense lawyers tried every trick in the book. They went with Mr. Peters as a line to save his own neck. Even went old man Raber was just a mental lightweight and a drunk that fell in the creek. Or maybe they, was even reaching to say it was a conspiracy by the insurance companies because they didn't want to pay these poor unwitting imbeciles what they were owed. Now, but Mr. Peters' testimony was too detailed, and the evidence in the form of multiple high-dollar insurance policies, along with the history of trying to kill the victim, well, that was just too damning to overcome. Now, the deliberations were so short that the jury may as well just stood straight up the gallery and said guilty, because every last one of them were found guilty. The judge didn't mess around either. No going back on his chambers to think it over. No hours of waiting to see what he was going to do. He took a deep breath and sentenced all of them to death by hanging. Of course, being that the trial, according to the defense, was nothing but a straight-up railroading job by the prosecutors, they filed appeals and the hangings were put on hold until after the outcome of them appeals. All of them were laughed out of court and denied except for George Zeckman, who got a second trial out of the deal. Mr. Zeckman was retried and found not guilty. Yes, he'd participated in the insuring of Joseph Raber, but the jury determined that he hadn't been party to the conspiracy. He was a known insurance investor and insured a whole passel of folks in the past with no foul play at all being involved in it. The execution of the Blue-Eyed Six was set for November 14th, 1879, the very next day after Mr. Zeckman's verdict was read. And it wasn't some private clinical execution. This was another circus. They built a big gallows in the prison yard. Thousands of people showed up. They even sold tickets to watch the hanging. People came from miles around, bringing picnic baskets, jugs of moonshine, and even their kids. It was a day out for the whole Blaine family, settling down to watch the Appalachian version of the Rockettes do their famous leg kick, except this one was coming at the end of a rope and looked a whole lot more like an involuntary twitch than anything else. They were led up the scaffold, and to the disappointment of the crowd who paid to see the sextet snapping necks. They were only two of them, Mr. Stickler and Mr. Drews. Two men stood on the trap door, and the crowd was as quiet as a funeral home, even though they did feel a little bit shorted on the number of necks snapping that they were going to hear. I reckon a twofer ain't what a six would be, but it's better than just one. Now, the sheriff adjusted the nooses, the drop was sprung, and the two necks snapped in stereo. Now, the crowd cheered like they'd just introduced the Charlie Daniels Band. So, with that over with, then came March 13th, 1880, when the whole show was repeated all over again. This time, Mr. Brandt, Mr. Hummel, and Mr. Wise were marched up the gallows and dropped into the hereafter, while folks ate their picnic lunches and sampled some of that newfangled ice cream and watched it like it was a Broadway play. No, I don't know if they honored the rain checks from the first ones where they bought the tickets or not, but anyway, that was the end of it. So there you have it. The tale of the Blue-Eyed Six. They thought they had a perfect crime, an accidental drowning, a fat insurance check, and everybody goes their separate ways, but they forgot two things. Dumb moves leave clues. Trying to kill a man 4 ways from Sunday ain't subtle. And greed makes people talk, especially when the man that holds the rope is promising to let you walk free. They wanted $8,000. They ended up hosting their own hemp necktie parties. As for Joseph Peters, well, he left the town, tried to start a new life, but you can't outrun a story like that. For the rest of his days, he was known as the Blue-Eyed Snitch, the man who brought his bought his life with the lives of his friends, a fate some might argue is worse than the rope. These old hills, well, they hold more secrets than ghosts. Sometimes they hide the worst parts of human nature. Well, until they're ready to make the monsters pay, I reckon. Remember, if somebody offers to pay your life insurance premiums, well, just don't make eye contact and back away slowly. Hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble or Spotify, throw us a like and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you listen or watch. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend podcast group on Facebook where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend, and I will see you then.